Claudia left one morning to visit her parents, who lived 10 miles away by the Thames River. When evening came and she hadn't returned, her husband Chester grew worried. He told their servant Molly about his concern as she served him dinner. Molly watched him eat alone by lamplight, troubled by the situation. She muttered that it wasn't right for a wife to leave after only 3 months of marriage, but Chester simply shrugged. Her opinion didn't matter to him. He was accustomed to solitude and didn't mind a night or two alone. After dinner, Chester stepped outside into the darkening night. Shadows gathered around the trees in the yard. In the distance, someone played a violin, and nearby a baby cried. His horse stood ready and saddled, waiting for the evening farm work that still needed doing. Chester tried not to think about Claudia, but her absence felt like a deep ache in his chest. That night, before sleep finally came, he was haunted by visions of her pale young face, her soft lips and brown eyes. He knew their marriage had been a mistake. He could see it in her eyes, sense that she was beginning to dislike him. Yet marriage was permanent, and Chester decided he would try to make it work. He hoped she would do the same. These melancholy thoughts kept him awake while moonlight flooded his room and the distant violin continued its mournful song. When Claudia didn't return the next day, Chester sent her brother Elton to bring her back. On the third day, he rode out himself. Claudia's parents lived in a large house owned by a merchant. The spacious upstairs rooms were often used for parties, and everyone loved dancing at the Lees' home and tasting Mrs. Lee's famous ravioli. When Chester arrived, Mrs. Lee stood on the porch, looking tense despite her usually friendly demeanor. Elton was there too, making no effort to hide his contempt. He whispered insults as Chester climbed the stairs. Elton had disliked Chester ever since he'd refused to lend him money years ago, and now that Chester had married his sister, the resentment had only deepened. Mrs. Lee explained that Claudia had locked herself in her room after a dance the night before. When Chester asked if they held dances every night, she laughed uncomfortably and told Elton to fetch his sister. Elton refused to move, stating bluntly that Claudia had made her intentions clear. She wasn't going back to Chester, and no amount of talking would change her mind. Chester's face flushed red. It was true that Claudia had told him before leaving that she was going to stay with her parents. She couldn't understand why she'd married in the first place. Girls were simply expected to marry, and while she did like Chester, she hated being married. When Elton had questioned her, asking if Chester mistreated her or drank too much, she'd said no. It was marriage itself she despised. She didn't want to be Mrs. Chester anymore. She wanted to be Claudia again, free from living with a man whose clothes were everywhere and whose bare feet she found unbearable. Chester walked calmly to Claudia's room and told her quietly to get ready, saying they'd wasted enough time. Unprepared for his composed request, Claudia felt trapped. She took her hat and gloves, walked past her mother and brother without a word, mounted her horse, and rode home with Chester following behind. That evening, Chester ate dinner alone again, while Claudia cried in her room. Her parents had hoped marriage would make her more mature and responsible, qualities they felt she lacked. No one understood why she hated being a wife so intensely. Chester had never shouted at her, insulted her, or denied her anything. His only faults seemed to be loving her, and Claudia refused to be loved against her will. At breakfast, Claudia confronted him, asking why he'd married her when so many other girls were available, and why he'd chosen his enemy's sister. Chester replied that he didn't know what her family had to do with anything. He'd married her because he loved her, though now he realized how foolish he'd been to think he could make her happy. All he could do was try to make peace with the situation. Claudia began to believe that Elton was her only true friend. Her parents had abandoned her, her friends mocked her, but Elton had a plan to help her gain freedom. After considering it, Claudia agreed. The next morning, Chester woke to find Claudia gone. She'd packed her things and left during the night. He felt devastated, though he'd sensed this coming for weeks. He'd missed his chance at happiness. He couldn't imagine loving another woman or Claudia ever caring for him. He wrote her a letter saying he wouldn't take her back unless she returned willingly. Claudia had escaped to Bradford, a large city where she stayed at a private hotel Elton had chosen and paid for. The hotel owner, Josephine, cared for her well. Claudia befriended another guest named Mr. Winston, which helped ease her loneliness. Winston soon fell in love with her, but he also suspected something Claudia hadn't realized. That despite everything, she loved her husband. He accepted this painful truth quietly. As Claudia's final week in the city arrived, she hadn't found work and felt desperately homesick. She'd also been feeling ill. When she mentioned her sickness to Josephine, the wise woman calmly explained that Claudia was pregnant. Claudia sat motionless for a long time, processing this revelation. Then a wave of happiness washed over her entire body. She stood up, filled with purpose. She had to tell her mother and Chester, as she thought of him, a completely new sense of life swept through her. She couldn't wait to return home. The next day, Claudia traveled back. When she arrived, Chester lifted her from the carriage, and they embraced tightly. The country night was cold and quiet, except for a baby crying somewhere in the distance. Claudia listened and whispered that poor Amanda's baby was crying, wondering what could be wrong. As they stood there holding each other, the distant crying seemed to fade, replaced by the promise of their own child and the love that had been waiting all along.